Tonight on The Late Show, Granada's hostages, exploration of fact or exploitation through fiction. Good evening. Granada's hostages, screened by ITV earlier this evening, has been at the heart of an expanding controversy. Coming in the drama documentary tradition of Who Bombed Birmingham and Lockerbie, which was pioneered by Granada, it purports to tell the story of the hostage experience in Beirut through a mixture of documentary footage, research fact, and judicious fiction. But with 4 of the 6 hostages portrayed refusing to talk to Granada and disassociating themselves from the project, the debate has become one about the moral responsibilities involved in representing somebody else's experiences, and raises the question, can those experiences be copyrighted by anyone? In a moment, I'll be discussing these issues with Roger Bolton, the man responsible for Death on the Rock, Peter Kosminsky, the director who made Shoot to Kill, the writer and critic Mark Lawson, and the man who researched and associate-produced Hostages, Alistair Palmer. First, the story behind the film. The story of Granada TV's Hostages began in September 1990 with the real-life drama of Brian Keenan's release after 4.5 years in captivity.
I felt that in the last place we were in, there was certainly another hostage.
When the project first went into production, other hostages depicted in the film, John McCarthy, Tom Sutherland, Terry Waite and Terry Anderson, were still being held in Beirut. At this stage, some of their relatives and friends gave their cooperation to Granada, as it offered an opportunity to publicize the plight of the hostages. However, just 2 weeks after a script was completed in August 1991, events took a new turn with John McCarthy's release.
And there he is. John McCarthy is home.
McCarthy voiced concern about Granada's project and refused to cooperate. Keenan, who until then had neither opposed nor supported the production, now aligned himself with McCarthy, as did Terry Anderson and Terry Waite when they were released later in 1991. Granada was now faced with a dilemma. While the hostages had remained captive, artistic license regarding dialogue and scenario was permissible. With the former hostages free, but refusing any input, all Granada had to go on was a script developed from interviews they had done with 2 of the American hostages, Tom Sutherland and Frank Reed, existing news footage, press conferences, and interviews. They decided to go ahead anyway.
Someday, maybe, someday, this experience might be valuable.
Brian, there is not one valuable second in any of this. These are lost years, totally lost. You know, one of the most useless things in the world is to be standing in a queue, and we've been in a queue now for 4 bloody years.
But not many people have been to the edge of the plank, like us. We see things differently. You know, when I was on my own, I hated it, but I found it fascinating. Sometimes I think I was totally insane. I was watching my own mind opening like a deranged flower.
A flower derangement?
Cut it out.
Just 2 days ago, McCarthy, Keenan, Anderson and Waite sent an open letter to the national press, stating that
we do appreciate the continued public interest in the hostages and would not seek to object to a wholly factual news programme on the subject or to wholly fictional works drawing inspiration from the issue. Without our cooperation, Granada have felt it permissible to invent very intimate aspects of our captivity and liberation. We feel that to do this, while claiming the film to be true, is both highly insensitive to the hostages and their families and a serious abuse of public trust.
for the former hostages, the question is, whose life is it anyway? But while they claimed the right to control their own story, Granada, in a letter issued the next day, claimed that there is no monopoly on truth.
The issue is, exactly which account will be the true or full story? Will it be Brian Keenan's account to be published the day after our film is transmitted? John McCarthy's? Terry Anderson's? Terry Waite's? Who will reconcile the inevitable differences? And how? Could any account, written from a specific standpoint, be the full story?
I remember at the press conference in Dublin, some journalist asked me a question, to which my reply then was, which is almost 2 years ago, perhaps the most difficult thing for each of us is to find a new bond of trust with the world. I don't think Granada has helped.
Gentlemen, Hostages is clearly a film that throws up a great many issues. Before we go on to that, though, we've all just seen it. I'd really like your response about a piece of television that you've just experienced. Peter Kosminsky, what did you think of it?
I enjoyed it as television. I think primarily because of the central performance of Kieran Hines as Brian Keenan. I thought it was extraordinary. It was still, it was mesmerizing as a performance, and we've seen his work before. This is without doubt his best work. I felt the pulling of the punches in terms of characterization and emotion. I felt the writer wanting to get under the skin of these characters, particularly with McCarthy, who was presented as almost a sort of very superficial schoolboy sense of humor, which we've seen and read about and heard about. There's clearly a lot more below the surface, and I think the writer felt he didn't have the legitimacy within the constraints of the format to go further, and as a piece of drama I think it suffered because of that.
Right. Mark Lawson.
Well, I have to be honest and say that I cried at the end, but in a rather curious way, that I was remembering the fact that I'd cried when McCarthy got out. And I felt that throughout the film, that it was reminding me in some vague way, as if the screen was blurred, of events that I'd been through. I thought it was technically very impressive. I thought morally there's a serious problem, and it's one of authority, which always comes up with this form. At several points in it, you thought, well, if they really said that at that time, then that's an astonishing thing to have said, or a thing to have done. And the great example of this was the candles scene. I mean, it may well be that Alistair will say that they know that to be true, but as a viewer, you don't. And like on a news program, people are very meticulous. They put up the white caption reconstruction, archive footage. And I felt throughout this that you wanted a white caption saying made up bit, true bit, because you just never knew. And it seemed it completely undermines the whole thing.
Roger Bolton.
Well, I admired the way it was made, but I'm trying to feeling a bit guilty here about why I wasn't moved more by it. And I think it was the fact that the images of the original release and the people themselves are so close to us, was so extraordinary. But it's very difficult for this sort of drama, so close to the events, to do other than, as Mark says, remind you of those events. And also, I think there are fundamental problems in the form. You do feel the researcher sitting on the shoulder of the dramatist saying, now hold on, you've got to steer it that way. I'm not entirely sure in the end what this drama was for. I knew who Bomb Birmingham was for, I knew what Lockerbie was for. They were doing something I don't think could be done any other way of invigorating the debate, widening the debate, bringing fresh details into a debate about real public issues and policy. There was a real point to that. I'm not in the end sure what this was for.
Alistair Palmer, what was it for? What was the intentions behind it?
The intention was to give the audience, the widest possible audience, some idea of what it was like to be a hostage, what the experience felt like, what the characters of these men were like, how they reacted to their incarceration. It was also to widen public understanding about the efforts of their friends and relatives to get them out, and to give some sense of the political machinations and the political context which led to these men being held for so long in such appalling conditions.
Although it has to be said that you do very little about explaining the internal politics of Lebanon or the politics going on behind the scene in the Foreign Office.
Yeah, no, I agree. I said that third, and I said it was to give a context. I mean, I think we do give a context, and I think the archive film serves that purpose. But we weren't trying to produce the final word on, what the causes for the breakup of Lebanon and the emergence out of the anarchy of extreme fundamentalist groups who believed that hostage-taking was a way to conduct foreign policy. I mean, that wasn't the point of the film, and that would have is much better done in a book. What we think this film did, and we think that we could only do through the medium of drama documentary or docudrama or whatever you choose to call it, is to look at the psychologies of these people and try to communicate it to as wide an audience as possible, the experience of being held as a hostage. And I think the film did that pretty successfully. And I think the reactions of these people are some testament to that.
Is that what you understand by drama documentary?
No, well, I mean, drama documentary is a flawed form, in my view, which is often worthwhile if it is a means of conveying something that you can't do in any other way. It is limited as drama, it's limited as documentary, but it can be justified. It was brilliantly done by Granada in a whole range of programs, going back to the Polish shipyards, the emergence of solidarity, to, as we said, who bombed Birmingham. Events which weren't covered on camera, we hadn't seen before, piecing together information, providing a context to political events, which we wouldn't have understood properly, I think, unless we'd watched those programs. And at the center of them all were real issues of political importance, or a real public issue that needed to be ventilated.
Not a personal stories.
Well, in the end, there wasn't a great deal of tension to this inevitably, because we know they got out at the end. I mean, there's sort of things, I don't think that's Granada's fault. I just think with that form, you had no option. Now, the things which I think a dramatist could have got into, for example, would have been to have looked at that through the eyes of the hostage takers. How were they reacting, which we don't know anything about really? How were they reacting to these curious hostages and their behavior? This would have been a fascinating area.
Can I bring in Mark? Yeah.
I think the important thing to understand is that Granada has changed the way that they treat the form of drama documentary, and that's the charge against them over this. That if you look at the previous stuff, and I agree with everything Roger said about this, I thought they were very impressive examples, Who Bombed Birmingham, but they did have a reason, but they were done in a particular way. And Granada made a huge fuss, particularly at the time of their reconstruction of Margaret Thatcher's last days. People were appearing, saying there were two sources for every single one. So when you've got a great story in that, like Heseltine's camp being sent 20 pieces of silver and all of that, you were reasonably sure it had happened. Now this time, they've taken much more liberty, and the astonishing thing that they've done is to imagine conversations in the cell for which they can have no real provenance. And Alistair raised the question, he said, we're trying to show what it's like to be a hostage. That's what I thought was the problem with this. Everyone watching these events thought, what is it like to be a hostage? But Bernard McClaverty, who wrote the script, is just thinking, what is it like to be a hostage? He doesn't know. You read something like Brian Keenan's book, you understand what it's like to be a hostage, and it's not surprising because he was one, and that's the whole point.
All right. Well, this brings up, in a sense, the larger moral issue as to whether or not it should have been done with or without their involvement. Peter Kosminsky, can I ask you, you have worked on drama documentaries. Shoot to Kill was about the stalker investigation of the RUC. Had you been offered this as a director, would you have taken it, given those ambivalent areas within it?
Me personally?
Yes, knowing that the four hostages did not want...
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. Although I think, in fairness to Granada, that position wasn't clear when they set out. Most of the hostages concerned were still in captivity. The issue for me really brings in the whole question of privacy, public access, what is in the public interest, what is in the public arena, which is a very live issue. We see this evening a live interview on News at 10 with Secretary Mellor, which is a very unusual event. Now, say in that interview this evening, he had resigned, and somebody like me, or Alistair, or somebody in our kind of area decided to do the rise and fall of David Mellor. You could sort of understand why they might have decided, on the grounds of impartiality and objectivity, to tell that story without going directly to Mellor. He's given many interviews, his views are in the public arena, let's stay objective. In that instance, because his own political axe to grind is more clear-cut, there's a certain argument in favour of steering clear of him. In this case, the issue is the same, but because feelings, intimate, internal thoughts are rather more critical, we feel, I think the problem is we feel uncomfortable.
Can you just make one thing clear, though? I mean, heaven only knows what the hostages felt watching this, if they did. I hope they didn't. But it should be said in Granada's defense that, first of all, there was nothing at all damaging to the public perception of those hostages, and that, in a way, one of the problems of it as drama was that they were scrupulous in many ways in what they allowed the writer to write. So there are problems. They clearly invented some dialogue. I accept Mark's point. But they also were very strict in the way they tried to adhere to what they did.
Well, surely one of the central problems, can I just put this question, is that it wasn't their story. Somebody else was telling stories based not on what they were saying, particularly about their relationship, what happened between them. Do you understand, Alistair, why the hostages are so upset that you went ahead, despite their disassociation?
I'm not sure I fully do, in the end, because I see that the story that we have chosen to tell and interpret is actually out there, almost all of it on the public record.
Although not anything on the public record about what they themselves felt about the experiences as they experienced.
Oh yes, there is. I mean, Brian Keenan's press conferences immediately after he came out is the most transparent and luminous and powerful expression of what it felt like to be a hostage. I would say, having read his book, it actually is more powerful and more illuminating than his book, great though the book is too. I mean, just the press conference, it had something special about it, simply because it was, you know, this sort of white mushroom coming out of the dark immediately and broadcasting to the world his thoughts and feelings.
Can I put it this way? Is it partly about the timing? They have said themselves publicly that this is happening before they have had time to make sense of their own story. And I wonder, in a sense, why Granada couldn't have held off and done this 6 months, 8 months later when their books were out, when their story was told, and you could have therefore capitalized on their story as well as your own and made a difference.
Well, you say they, but of course, you know, they're 5 different guys, 6 different guys, and you're treating them as if they were a single mass, and of course they're not a single mass. They are different men with different attitudes, and they're writing different books. Some of them aren't writing books at all. I mean, Brian Keenan's book is coming out the day after our picture. Has he come to terms with his experience or not now? I don't know. Has John McCarthy? Will he come to terms with it in a year, in 5 years? I mean, of this, there is no end, it seems to me. We would be in a position where we would never make anything.
Could I pick up that distinction? Because Granada say a lot, and they've written to me about this, because I wrote about the programme objecting to it. They draw a comparison with journalism, and they say, well, you're a journalist, I'm a journalist, your newspapers have written about these people, you do it all the time, you don't ask their permission. Now, that seems convincing, but the difference is, it seems to me the proper analogy is it's as if a newspaper published an article saying, by John McCarthy, by Brian Keenan, My Life in Captivity, which they put together from all the stuff on the record. Now, if we did that, we'd be taken to the Press Council, and they would win, and we'd be in a lot of trouble. Now, there's no way they can take Granada anywhere for this. And the thing that Alistair says about the hostages being that you're treating them as a mass, but I mean, it'd be better in a way if they had. I mean, a comparison often used, Frank McGuinness plays on stage at the moment, someone to watch over me. He does treat them as a mass. He creates fictional hostages. You're treating them individually, that's the problem. These are named people called John McCarthy, Brian Keenan. And also, the thing I admire about, to use that term, the hostages, but these hostages over this, is that they're arguing a very subtle point. People say they come out of this very well, but they're saying that doesn't matter. It's not how we come out of it, it's to do with who owns this experience.
Well, can I put that back to you? Because there are a number of other times when television comes in with great insensitivity in the ideas of some people. I mean, I'm thinking of true life crimes which pick up the experiences of somebody murdered with... I'm thinking of the Rachel Ward case when their daughter was murdered. The man who did it was already in prison, and it was a reconstruction, and the parents objected bitterly. But they don't have the kind of public persona of the hostages. What makes their experience different from anyone else's?
Well, I mean, not having spoken to the hostages, I think the hostages would be on the side of the family of someone like Rachel McLean. I think it was astonishing and disgraceful that her parents had to watch only a few months after her death Michael Winner's True Crime. I think it's part of the same issue. I think that the hostages are being quite brave. The only thing they could do against this is they could go into a court of law if they thought there'd been libel. They haven't. So they are trying to raise the issues. So I think it is the same issue. They just have a higher public profile.
It is a big issue, Peter, you brought up earlier. It is who owns experience.
What worries me about this argument, Mark, is that this debate about this particular film is taking place in a wider context. Now, I think you'd have to be extremely callous not to accept that for Keenan and McCarthy watching this film, it would have been probably a doubly painful experience. Partly it might conceivably have caused them to relive unpleasant experiences. They also probably saw all the faults, all the errors, which are inevitable. And you'd have to be fairly callous not to say it was tough for them. But I'm concerned about this very specific comment about this film being extended to the generality of a subject that we know, to certainly to very prominent members of the governing party, is anathema, the idea of dramatizing real events with real people with their real names. Now, just let me finish. Yeah. When you get into a situation where somebody is involved in a corruption issue, a fraud issue, some kind of issue that we would feel as journalists is worthy of public scrutiny and debate, are we going to say that person has a veto on a dramatized investigation of that just because they haven't cooperated? I think that's very dangerous.
Well, that's a fundamental problem, of course. There is no law I can conceive of, or nothing which would cover, which would separate off people like the hostages from, say, Robert Maxwell, or other people who indeed should be exposed. So I think that all we have to say in this, it's a question of decency, what we think is